Good evening. My name is Craig Shalliford, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life in their communities and strengthen their democracy. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to just remind you to turn off any devices that may make sound during the program. Tonight's speaker, Secretary Andrew H. Card Jr., is from Holbrook, Mass., and is a graduate of the University of South Carolina with a BS in engineering. He also attended the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Card served in the U.S. Navy from 1965 to 1967. Secretary Card received his start in politics as an elected official of Holbrook, and then as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1975 to 1983. He is the second longest tenured White House Chief of Staff and served in senior government roles under 3 U.S. presidents. He served as Secretary of Transportation under George H.W. Bush and as the Chief of Staff for George W. Bush. While Chief of Staff, he coordinated the priorities of administration's agendas, the development of policies, and the appointments of cabinet secretaries and senior officials throughout the government. Interestingly, Secretary Card is the one who whispered in President Bush's ear while the president was sitting in a classroom in Florida that terrorists had attacked the United States. Recently, from 2015 to 2016, he served as president of Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire. Prior to being at Franklin Pierce, Secretary Card also held positions at Texas A&M, including acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Currently, Secretary Card serves on the board of directors of several for- and nonprofit boards. Tonight, he'll be joining us for a discussion on his experiences. Following Secretary Card's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. There will be microphone stands on both sides to ask questions. Please line up and ask questions in row. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Andrew Card.
Thank you, Greg. It's a thrill to be at St. A's. And I appreciate that I can park the car at Harvard Yard and most of you will understand me. I give speeches around the country and losing the R's doesn't go over well. But I can speak with my Boston accent. I do want to introduce my wife, Kathleen, who is sitting right up front here. My wife and I met in the 5th grade. And this is a remarkable year for us because we both turned 70, but we also celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary. So. St. A's is a very, very good school. And I have known about St. A's for a long time. My youngest brother graduated from St. A's, and he is still a very, very proud alumnus and very actively engaged in what you do. He lives in Washington, D.C., but he spends a lot of time in New Hampshire, and believe me, he keeps me well informed, and he does challenge the school frequently because he has lots of opinions. He also was a hockey player, and hockey players are kind of strange. And he was passionate about playing hockey at St. A's, so I'm glad to be at St. A's. I also appreciate that this room is a very special room. My picture is in the back up there. I look like the Good Humor ice cream man. I'm wearing a white suit, but I'm not the one with the tie on. And that was a remarkable experience because I was with a governor, then vice president, and went on to become president. And that was a memorable picture, although most people who walk in the room pay no attention to me. I did end up becoming chief of staff to the president. I'll tell you a little bit about that, but there is another picture of a chief of staff in this room. And he was the first formal chief of staff. And that would be in the 3rd picture down the line there. And that is Sherman Adams, who is kind of looking at you rather than at the president or Governor Hugh Gregg. So Sherman Adams was the first chief of staff. He was chief of staff to Dwight David Eisenhower, and he was a former governor of New Hampshire. And he went on to kind of give great momentum to New Hampshire's great skiing opportunities. So he helped create the skiing industry, which has been very important. So there are two chiefs of staff in pictures hanging on the walls at this institute. I should tell you that if you're ever asked to be the chief of staff, you should try to find a way to say yes, you'd like to do it. But the president likely does not go to monster.com to recruit chief of staff. And if you apply to be the chief of staff, chances are you will never be one. Presidents usually decide who their chief of staff will be, and you don't know the process that they're going to go through to find their chief of staff. The chief of staff's responsibilities are pretty significant, but they're not institutionalized anywhere. The only bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. that is not organized by Congress happens to be the bureaucracy at the White House. And the president has given a very free hand on how to organize the White House. I happen to think that it's right to have a chief of staff, someone who is responsible for running the White House, but there's no obligation that the president do that. And so for a long time, presidents did not have chiefs of staff. Dwight David Eisenhower was not the first president of the United States, but he was the first president to have a chief of staff. And that's because he brought the expectation of organization from his experience in the military to the White House. And he wanted to have someone that would organize the White House to help him do the job as chief of staff. So how did I become the chief of staff to the President of the United States? I'm from Holbrook, Massachusetts, which is 15 miles south of Boston. Greg was kind to say I was from Holbrook. And I grew up in a family where politics was not a dirty word. My grandmother had been a suffragette. She fought for women to get the right to vote. And she was a militant suffragette. And if you go to Holbrook and go through the old records, you'll find that my grandmother was the first woman to register to vote in Holbrook when women got the right to vote, which was in August of 1920. And she was quite controversial because she registered to vote, but she also filed to be a candidate. And she ran for the school committee because she was passionate about public education. She got elected to the school committee and served for an awful long time. I grew up right across the street from my grandmother. Because I was not always well behaved, I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house. And when she convened for dinner, we'd sit around the dining room table, and she would always offer a blessing, so we couldn't start the meal without having a blessing. But we were not allowed to pick up an eating utensil until we responded to her when she said, "Tell me something from the newspaper today." And everybody had to say something from the newspaper before they could pick up a fork or a knife or a spoon. And anything was fair game. So I did the Red Sox, the Celtics, the Bruins. I was a sports guy. You could have done cartoons or the weather, but inevitably, every conversation centered around something to do with public policy or politics, or who was doing what on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., or in Beacon Hill in Boston. So we knew the name of our state representative, state senator, congressman, governor, United States senator. We knew. And almost every meal, the conversations turned into an argument, which was exactly what my grandmother loved, but she would not allow us to agree. And she would say, "That's your opinion. Now I want you to go find out why you think your opinion is right." So she assigned homework at almost every meal. And I can remember kind of, "Oh no, we have dinner at Grandma's tonight. I've got to read the newspaper." But what a blessing. Because she also said, the most important word in the Constitution was the very first word, we. And she said, when I grew up, we was not an all-inclusive word. For you, we is all-inclusive. It's our government, and we have a responsibility to participate in the government. So she said, if you're asked to serve, you serve. Find a way to run for public office. Definitely vote. But remember, we. It's the most important word in the Constitution. It's our government. What a great blessing. So I ran for local office and got elected to the planning board right after I graduated from college. I volunteered on campaigns even before I went to college, during college and after college. And yes, I voted, and I couldn't wait to be able to cast my vote. And I couldn't wait to run for office and to serve. And Greg didn't mention this in the introduction, but I ran a forgettable campaign for governor of Massachusetts. It was forgettable because I lost, but it was unforgettable because I had opportunities, because I stepped on the stage and ran. By the way, when I say I lost, I have to tell you a true story. I did lose, but I was standing the day after the election on a stage at a hotel in Boston with my family, my very proud family, and I was said to the press that was there that I was very grateful for all the people that supported me, and I was very proud of my third place finish. My son, who was about 5 years old at the time, yanked my pant leg and said, "Dad, you came in last." I preferred to think of it as third. But I lost in that Republican primary. But something happened that caused me to think about my grandmother. Because right after the election, I got a call from James A. Baker III, Chief of Staff to President Ronald Reagan. And he said, "Andy, would you like to come to Washington to work for President Reagan?" That's an invitation. And I went to Washington, D.C., and I served at the White House. And I got to observe and help a chief of staff and a president. That invitation that came was a pretty unbelievable invitation. And I happen to feel strongly that if any president invites you to help solve a problem, you should find a way to say yes, even though you may not like the president. But that invitation was a remarkable invitation. And I went to Washington, D.C. with my wife and our children, and it was an experience that was just beyond comprehension. At the time, I had a little red 1976 Chevy Chevette, and I remember the gates to West Executive Ave opening up, and I drove that clunker into the driveway and parked right near the vice president's limousine. And I said, "This is going to be a dream, don't pinch me." It's remarkable. But the experience of working at the White House also taught me what it means to support a president on the White House staff and what the burden of a chief of staff is like. Obviously, the president gives definition to our country, gives definition to the executive branch of government. It gives definition to hopes and dreams that other people have around the world that they think we have in the United States and they all want. But I came to realize that the chief of staff also plays a significant role because they give definition to how the White House works. And James A. Baker III was a remarkable chief of staff. And I remember going to my very first policy meeting in the West Wing of the White House, in the Roosevelt Room, And I was the liaison to the nation's governors. I had a very long title, Special Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs, Liaison to Governors and Statewide Elected Officials. I must be very important. And then I learned the longer your title, the less important you are. President, Vice President, Chief of Staff, Special Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs, Liaison to Governors and Statewide Elected Officials. I wasn't that important. But my job was important because President Reagan had been a governor and he cared about the governors. Conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, he cared about them. But I remember being invited to this very first meeting in the Roosevelt Room of the West Wing of the White House, and I showed up early, kind of nervous, and there was a woman setting up name tags on a table. And I walked over, and she looked at me, and she said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Andy Card." And she looks at me and she said, "Are you Baker or Meese?" Jim Baker was the chief of staff. Ed Meese was counsel to the president. And then there was another leader in the White House, Mike Deaver. And I said, I'm Andy Card. And she said, "Who do you work for?" And I said with pride, "The president." And with disgust, she says, "Where do you work?" I said, "Intergovernmental Affairs." And she says, "Baker." And my name came out and went on one side of the table. And then I found that names on the other side of the table were all connected to Meese. And the names on the ends of the table were connected to Deaver. Baker, Meese, Deaver. A troika was managing the White House. 3 people, James A. Baker III, Mike Deaver, Ed Meese. And I learned that knowledge is power. And if you husband your knowledge, you can maximize your opportunity for power, which meant people didn't share information very much until it was to their power advantage. And I found that to be frustrating. And then the troika broke up, and Ed Meese became the Attorney General. Mike Deaver went off to the private sector, and Jim Baker was left alone as Chief of Staff. And wow, the White House changed. Changed dramatically. We had the same president, actually had the same Chief of Staff. But the Chief of Staff was the Chief of Staff. There was no troika. And I got to see how the White House worked. And I thought that was the best model. And today, I think that was the best model. And James A. Baker III, Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, without the troika, was the way to run a White House. And then I'm still working at the White House, tremendously excited about what I'm doing. Jim Baker becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury becomes the Chief of Staff, Don Regan. And he brings with him 3 very competent people. We called them the 3 blind mice. And they organized the White House. And it was a very different White House. Had the same president, different Chief of Staff, very different White House. And then Don Regan left as Chief of Staff. And I learned a valuable lesson. Don't get crosswise with the First Lady, because he got crosswise with the First Lady. And his tenure was relatively short. I learned another valuable lesson. And I'm going to plead with all of you to remember this no matter where life takes you. When you write a letter of resignation, write a letter of resignation so that your grandchildren will be very proud of the job that you did. Don John Regan wrote an angry letter of resignation. And he's remembered more for that letter of resignation than the good job that he did. But Don Regan left as chief of staff, and in came Howard Baker, senator from Tennessee. And it was a very different White House. Same president, very different White House. And then Howard Baker left, and Ken Duberstein came in to be chief of staff. He'd been a deputy chief of staff, but he was kind of a transitional chief of staff because there was an election taking place. And we were getting ready to elect a new president, and that was George H.W. Bush. And when George H.W. Bush became president, you expected it to be a very different White House. You had a different president. It turned out to be a very different White House because John H. Sununu was his chief of staff. And it was a very different White House. And I was privileged to become the White House deputy chief of staff to John Sununu. But you know John Sununu, he's probably the most intelligent person I've ever met. Not always that smart. But he also knew that nobody else was as smart as they should be, and I happen to be the closest dumb person to him. What a great lesson I learned on how to run a White House. And it was a very different White House. And then John Sununu left as chief of staff. And in came Sam Skinner. Sam Skinner had been the Secretary of Transportation. And he ran a very different White House. And he was afraid to make decisions. But one of the responsibilities for a chief of staff is to make penultimate decisions. Not the ultimate decisions, but penultimate decisions. And they're very tough. And I got to observe him as he was chief of staff. But I had a little different perch because I was named Secretary of Transportation, succeeding Sam Skinner, so I was at the Department of Transportation in the cabinet. But I did observe and go to the White House a lot, and I saw that Sam Skinner was struggling as chief of staff. And then he left as chief of staff after about 6 months. And James A. Baker III came back to be chief of staff, the president's best friend, but he didn't want to be chief of staff because he was the Secretary of State. But the presidency was challenged and the election was not going well. And Secretary Baker gave up the title secretary, took that old title, chief of staff, and filled the role. I tell you that story because I think my observation of how the White House worked under a chief of staff is what caused George W. Bush to ask me to be his chief of staff. I think I was the only person that worked under every one of those scenarios for Ronald Reagan and George Bush. So I think that's why he asked me to be his chief of staff. But let me tell you what the job of a chief of staff is. And this doesn't make any difference who the president is, what the personality of the president is, what the partisanship of the president is. This is the job. And I'm actually taking this information objectively from an academic, Roger B. Porter, who's a professor at Harvard. And he's at the Harvard Business School, he's at Harvard College, and he's at the Kennedy School. And he worked under a number of presidents. And he wrote a book about organizing the White House. And I thought his description of the responsibilities of the chief of staff was the most accurate. Number one responsibility is the care and feeding of the president. You don't want a president that worries about the wrong things. And you also don't want a president who ever makes an easy decision. Because if they're making an easy decision, they're wasting time. And you also want them to be in a frame of mind so that they can make a very difficult decision when the decision needs to be made. And you don't get to decide when that is sometimes. Sometimes it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes it's with lots of notice. So the care and feeding of the president is like really important. And all of you should want to be president because you're very well cared for. You never have to worry about buying gas for your car. The Secret Service does that and it shows up ready at a time. Your luggage never gets lost. The plane goes to the right airport. Your bed is made. Your laundry is done. You can have your favorite meal and you don't even have to cook it. The papers on your desk are the right papers. If the job is being done well by the chief of staff, there's an X on the stage where you're supposed to stand and the teleprompter is working, the backdrop looks good. That's the care and feeding of the president. And that's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week responsibility. It does not get a lot of attention, but more people work to help care for the president than any other aspect of people's jobs at the White House. The president doesn't mow the lawn, somebody else does that. The rose garden has tulips planted in it so they come up in spring. The president doesn't plant them, but he expects the rose garden to look nice. The care and feeding, big job. And that's the job of the chief of staff. The second part of the job, according to Roger Porter, is policy formulation. And that's what you argue about all the time. And that's what you think the real cool part of the job is. And yes, chiefs of staff are involved in every policy decision. At least they should be. But it's less that they are the policy expert. Their job is to make sure there are experts participating in the policy debate. So it's a process responsibility. What is the policy process? And you want to make sure that nobody is a bully in the process. And think about it. Most people who advise a president are very competent. They're experts. Most of them are quite confident. And many of them have type A personalities, so they're even a little bit arrogant in their confidence and their expertise. And since the president should never get monolithic counsel, the chief of staff's job is to make sure that that overly confident, type A personality, competent individual doesn't bully the process to preclude other views coming into the president. So I view the job of policy is making sure that the president does not get skewed counsel. It doesn't get fooled into believing that this is an easy solution because it's supposed to be hard. So the process was critically important in the policy formulation, and that's what I had to do. And then the final responsibility, according to Roger Porter, is the following. If the president makes a decision and nobody knows about it, did the president make a decision? And the decisions are frequently so tough that the president makes a tough decision after he or she has read lots of documents, listened to advice and counsel, sought outside advice, agonized over it, probably slept on it, maybe even spoke to his spouse about it, probably prayed about it, and then the president shows up for work. And the chief of staff is the first person to greet the president when he comes to work. And I would always greet the president like with phenomenal optimism. Top of the morning, Mr. President. Good morning to you. And I didn't care how bad the weather was. I wanted him to be in a good mood every day. You don't want a pessimist as a president. The last thing you want is the president walks into the Oval Office and says, I'm going to make a bad decision today. They're going to make a tough decision. So I would greet the president with great optimism when he walked into the Oval Office. Top of the morning, Mr. President. Let me tell you what your day is going to be like. And he would tell me what he decided on the policy. I made my decision. So the final responsibility that Roger Porter said the chief of staff has is marketing and selling. Taking the president's decision and communicating it to the right people with the right expectation and motivation so that the implementation will live up to the president's expectation. So the communications responsibility for a chief of staff is quite challenging, because by definition, if it's not monolithic council, even people on the staff don't agree with what the president said. You want them to respect it. They don't have to agree with it. But they have to say, we'll help to implement it. So, care and feeding of the president, policy formulation, marketing, and selling, job of a chief of staff, has nothing to do with conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat. And the chief of staff's job is to organize those three functions: the care and feeding, the policy process, and the communications process. Because the White House also doesn't implement anything. Congress doesn't appropriate the money for the White House to do anything except make decisions. The implementation is the responsibility of other areas of the executive branch. And Congress gets to second guess them, because they have to go testify before Congress on their budgets. So the communications is very significant when you have to go outside the White House. So the organization is pretty tight, but there's no one template for it. But those tasks don't change, no matter how you organize the White House. The president still needs to be well cared for, there's still going to be a process for policy, and you've still got to tell people what the decisions were. So let me talk about some of the challenges that I have seen in the current White House. And I'm not picking on this White House, because every White House has a challenge. In fact, we all have an expectation that the first 100 days will define a presidency. And President Jack Kennedy made sure that we all had a 100-day plan, because FDR had a 100-day plan, and everybody wanted to have a 100-day plan. So every president has a 100-day plan. And I remember when we were coming in with President George W. Bush, I'm the chief of staff, and we were working with the transition. Before we even took office, we had a 100-day plan. And we knew what we wanted to do on day 13 and day 22 and day 66, and you had a plan. But the first thing that the chief of staff has to do is to make sure that there is a plan, and that there are people with tunnel vision focusing on that plan. But the chief of staff's job is to have peripheral vision, so it's not just all about the plan, because other things happen. So here we are on day 66-ish of the 100 days under Donald Trump. I'm going to tell you the 100-day plan that I was part of with George W. Bush. We had lots of things that distracted us from the plan. And so has President Trump. I remember things that distracted us pretty early on, and some of you will remember this. Here we are making big plans to do things, and all of a sudden I get word that a submarine, a US submarine, popped up off the coast of Hawaii, right underneath the Japanese fishing boat. Now, not a big deal, unless you're the captain of the submarine. Or if you're the head of Japan. So that was very disruptive. We had to deal with all this diplomatic challenge, we had to deal with a military challenge, because the USS Greenville popped up and hit a Japanese fishing boat. Wasn't in the plan, but you have to deal with it. And then we're cruising down, getting ready to go to the last 30 days of the 100 days, and we have a wonderful plan. We know what we're going to do. We're talking education and tax cuts for everybody. And there's a flood in Mississippi. Oh, now we got to go to Mississippi and deal with the flood. Or Slobodan Milosevic, a war criminal, gets found and arrested. Well, guess we're not going to dominate the news tonight. It's going to be Slobodan Milosevic. Oh, Mr. President, one of our planes, an EP-3, was hit by a Chinese plane and forced to land on Hainan Island. And nobody's answering the phone in China. And they've got our pilots and crew of that plane, and they've got the plane, and it's a plane that was a secret plane, and they're probably stealing our secrets. All within the 100 days. And then we go to Mexico. We want to have a meeting with the President of Mexico. We go to his ranch. Everything is all set for a wonderful conversation. Just as we're ready to go out to meet the press and talk to folks about what the two presidents talked about, I get word that one of our planes shot a missile and hit a radar facility outside of Baghdad because Saddam Hussein had violated the no-fly zone and turned on radar. And so now what dominates the conversation? Cruise missile from a plane hitting a radar facility in Iraq. None of that in the 100-day plan, but it becomes reality. So, what you do though is keep your eye on the responsibilities that you have with tunnel vision and make sure other people have peripheral vision to understand what else is happening in the world so that you can deal with those and not lose a step. So President Trump organizes the White House, and the truth is he organized it in such a way that I think that he invited more problems than solutions. Because one of the first things he did was he named a chief of staff. But then he named others that would have the same access as the chief of staff. And so that meant that he would have lots of people coming into his office, which sounds good, but it takes away from the discipline. And so we saw the organization of the White House starting to fracture even before the organization was put in place, because there were different power centers. And it reminded me of the Troika under Ronald Reagan, when Jim Baker was there, and I was a witness to how it didn't work very well. So I was skeptical that that process would work. And I felt bad for Reince Priebus, who was given the assignment of being the chief of staff. But he would have Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner and Ivanka and Kellyanne all having direct access to the president, which I'm sure is very comforting to the president. But it means the discipline of the White House is such that time can be wasted. You take up space in the president's head, and that's the toughest thing for a chief of staff to pay attention to. Who has what space in the president's head? That's the care and feeding. And so I was troubled by the organization of the White House. Then I got some comfort, because Reince Priebus hired as deputy chief of staff for operations someone who I had hired to be deputy chief of staff for operations. And he had worked at the White House for a long time, and boy, did he know how to keep things running on time. He'd been a presidential scheduler. He was deputy chief of staff when I was chief of staff, and he knew trains, planes, and automobiles, and Secret Service, and military office, and how to make sure the president had the right information in front of him to deliver a speech or the right backdrop. Perfect. Organizationally outstanding. But he's not the policy organization. It was the logistics organization. It was the care and feeding. And I was thrilled that that was someone that Reince Priebus brought in, because I said, there'll be good discipline. And I've been impressed by the discipline that President Trump's White House has had in how they've organized events and traveled. And the luggage doesn't get lost. And the motorcade goes to the right place. And the Secret Service is well informed, and they know what's going to happen. And they kind of create a climate where it can happen. So I was comforted. But then I looked at the policy process and I said, There doesn't appear to be a process. And Donald Trump was elected with a significant expectation that he was going to change the way Washington works. And boy, he has changed the way Washington works. He's introduced sand in the gears and tweets that define momentum. So Washington is shaken up. And he also brought with him a high expectation on policy. And some of it is very well articulated. But there wasn't a process to understand the policy. When I talked about the policy responsibility of the Chief of Staff, policy is actually a very easy thing to find. Lots of people have policy ideas. And so the policy itself is not that hard. Understanding the consequences of policy is much harder. So the process is less about the policy, and it's more about the consequence of the policy. And you want to have a process so that the unintended consequences are not unintended. So that you have intended consequences. You can say, if you do this, this will happen, and you can say, is that the right thing to happen or the wrong thing to happen? If it's the wrong thing to happen, do we have to modify the policy so it doesn't happen? But the last thing you want is a whole bunch of unintended consequences. And the first immigration executive order that was released by the White House was actually kind of an exciting policy, controversial as could be, but it ended up being defined, I'm convinced, by the unintended consequences, which meant they didn't have a process to say, what about the people with the green card who are on a plane on their way to Boston? Do we let them get off the plane? And they could have said, oh yeah, we should let them get off the plane. Or have extra screening. There were lots of unintended consequences that ended up defining that policy. And unfortunately now, we all define the policy by the unintended consequences. And to me, that was a policy flaw. Not so much a policy flaw in the policy itself, but in the consequences to the policy as it was originally written. So that's just my example of the importance of having a structure at the White House. And right now we're dealing with another challenge for the White House, which is they have a policy expectation of changing the Affordable Care Act. But that policy process was being left more to people outside the White House than inside the White House. And that's a little strange because policy makers in Congress love to have the direction of the president so that they can have the cover of the president around the policy that's made. But then it comes down to the implementation of the policy. And this is the implementation of the policy to be implemented. And they didn't do the homework to invite governing to be part of the solution. Instead, it was my way or the highway. But he couldn't even say where the highway would lead. And that comes down to organization at the White House again. So I think they're still in the learning process of how to do this. The first 100 days is supposed to be a learning process as well. And the president still has 40 days-ish, a little less than that, to finish his 100 days. It comes the end of April. And he's going to have some big tests. Some of them should have been anticipated. The continuing resolution to fund government runs out. That's a policy process with reality that makes it difficult to come up to a decision. The debt ceiling will probably be exceeded, so there'll be a great debate over the debt ceiling. Those are not the things that Donald Trump talked about in a campaign, but he'll have to deal with those things. So you have to have a process to deal with it. You need a right hand and a left hand connected to the same body at the White House, but someone should make sure that the brain is connected to the right hand and the left hand so that they are not working in conflict with each other. With that, I give President Trump high marks for communicating with the American people. I'm a little nervous in how he communicates. I am digitally challenged. I'm still an analog guy, but he is definitely part of the digital world. And he is very efficient with his zeros and ones. And they go flying out at 3:30 in the morning, and they touch about 30 million people, which is amazing. ABC, NBC, and CBS combined do not touch 30 million people in a day. So he has a tremendous network, and I give him credit for understanding how to reach so many people. But I also find that as a challenge when it comes to having a process for policy and a process of managing expectations of when the policy will mature enough so that it can be implemented. And that's the marketing and selling responsibility. So I think Reince Priebus is probably challenged by tweets. And that's part of the communications responsibility. With that, why don't I open it up for questions? I do not want to overstay my welcome. I do want you to pay tribute to Sherman Adams up there because he started the whole thing as the chief of staff, and Dwight David Eisenhower gave the structure to the White House that it is today. And I would be glad to answer your questions. I am not the least bit afraid to acknowledge my partisanship. Okay? If I were to stand up here and say, I am completely objective, you would say, no, you're not. Well, I'm probably not. I am defined by where I have been and what I have done. And I'm very grateful that my grandmother taught me that we word, the short word we, includes me. So yes, I will participate in our government, and you don't have to agree with me. I don't even have to agree with you. What I will do is I will respect you. So don't be bashful with your questions, and if you don't want to respect me, that's okay too, because I know that First Amendment of the Constitution gives you the right not to be respectful. But I also want to plead with you to understand that First Amendment of the Constitution is like really important. Freedom of speech is critically important in a democracy. The right of association is critically important in a democracy. You have the right to associate. The press has the right to write about us. And we have to give them that right, although there's no definition of what the press is in the Constitution. It's kind of self-described. I'm the press. But there's another provision in that First Amendment that most of you forget about. It's the right to petition government to address your grievances. First Amendment right. And more of us should have the courage to ask government to address our grievances. So speak up. With that, why don't I open up the questions, and don't be bashful. And if you have no questions, then I know you're not part of the we, and I want you to be part of the we. So have some opinions.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight. My question surrounds the when you were talking about letting certain people into taking space in the president's head and whatnot. There was a lot of different opinions in the president's cabinet surrounding the decision to go into Iraq, and speaking with the UN regarding WMDs
Sure.
and such. I was just wondering, how did you control that situation? Because you had a lot of big players in President Bush's cabinet, and that's a tough decision, as you said, to control different things. How did you control that?
Well, first of all, we had a process, and it was a structured process, the National Security Council. And there were reforms put in place during President Reagan's tenure that invited the domestic side of the White House into the national security side of the White House. It was in response to the Iran-Contra controversy. And so there was a committee formed called the Deputies Committee in the national security structure, but it included someone from the Chief of Staff's office. So that became an entree where, especially matured under George H.W. Bush, where the domestic side of the White House was supposed to be involved in the foreign policy side of the White House, so that there couldn't be rogue activities taking place in the foreign policy world. And that was very much what happened. So we did have a structure that included people from the domestic side as well as the foreign policy, the defense side, the intelligence side, the diplomatic side in the process. So there was a good, solid process in place to analyze potential problems, potential policy, and to better understand the consequences. But ultimately, tough decisions have to be made. And the toughest decision the president has to make is to send young men and women into harm's way. And I do not want you to believe that that is not a tough decision. It is brutally tough. And so, and you get the best information you can, but unlike in academia, and I have great respect for people who are PhDs. PhDs have tunnel vision. They have to have discipline. They work very hard to discover a new truth or a new theory or a new solution to a problem. And they work with blinders on to analyze that potential truth. And then they have to submit it to a group of their peers who are institutionally skeptical, and they challenge that. And so most people in the academic world are afraid to take a risk. They don't want to give you an answer until they know the answer, rather than come close to the answer. I found in government, time does not allow you to always find the perfect answer. So you have to deal with the challenge that you have and the timeline of responsibility as to when the decision must be made so that it can be implemented. And there's always a lag between the decision and the implementation. And going to war is a great example where that problem is magnified. So, but look, we thought there were WMD. I'm not aware of any country in the world that didn't think that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The Chinese, the Russians, the French, the Germans, the British, the Italians, the Israelis, all of the intelligence communities thought that he had weapons of mass destruction or the means to constitute them quickly. We also know that what he had done with weapons of mass destruction to his own people. So that was an intelligence blunder, but it was a blunder that the entire world believed. Now, there were lots of different opinions of what to do about it. The French might say, so what? He has them, but so what? Other countries would say, sure he has them, we'd like them too. But the United States said he shouldn't have them. So yes, that was a tough one. And we got it wrong, but believe me, nobody was suggesting that we got it wrong during that process. And there were some other intelligence challenges as we were organizing to build up for the war. Going to war was not easy though, and the president did not go to war because he wanted to. And we were trying everything we could to avoid war, and actually we were trying to get Saddam Hussein to cut a deal with somebody else to get out of town. And he wouldn't take any deal. But yeah, the process was there. I'm proud of the process. Do I wish I had more knowledge? There was a great book written by Lawrence Wright called The Looming Tower. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, he was a journalist. And I wish that he had written the book before we went to war, but he wrote it after we went to war. And I wish he had written it before because I learned a lot by reading his book. But those are the challenges. You have to deal with the situation it is. But I'm comfortable. I know it's controversial, and I wear an American flag because I was a party to everybody going to war, and I saw what happened. It was not right.
All right, excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
We didn't pay the bill.
I've been in the dark before.
I guess I know the phrase the first 100 days still has media currency, and I can understand the value of a broad deadline as a management tool. But I'm kind of wondering whether it's like 80 years or so after the PR legacy, why we still cling to that, and also whether you think that it would be more advantageous for a president, especially an incoming president of a different party than his predecessor, to instead of going to the grand design on health care, both Clinton and Obama came a cropper in the midterms following. Possibly Trump is heading in that same direction. With this, I don't know. It's an embarrassment. But would it be better to go for low-hanging fruit on several other items that would, be consistent with the philosophy of the party they're in, whatever it is, rather than go for that grand design and shoot your wad?
Okay, I'll try to answer the question. It's good to have some kind of discipline. 100-day gives kind of discipline to a process. And even if the White House didn't want to have a 100-day plan, the media would claim that they had one, and they'd want to hold the president accountable just because. So does the president want to be bound to the 100-day plan? No. Will the press hold him up to a 100-day plan? Yes. So he has to have a 100-day plan. I don't think that it should define a presidency, and I don't think they should try to get everything done in 100 days. The question of taking low-hanging fruit, I do feel it's better to have a process that builds success. So I like low-hanging fruit and a cadence to success so that the successes can get bigger over time rather than have a relatively quick failure that causes you to work extra hard to find another win, but it will never be as big as the win you thought you were going to have with the first win. So I would have done things differently, candidly, and have had more of a process around the healthcare debate and understand the consequences of the current law a little bit more and better educate the American people to what those consequences are and find out how many of them were unintended, and then work to address those unintended consequences and have a more substantive process on the Hill that would invite members of Congress to be a governing solution. And I don't think President Trump did enough job of inviting people to be part of a solution. And that is a process that starts very early on. And so I just think they ran a little bit too fast on a very big issue, and I would have slowed down. But I can understand why they want to do it, but I don't think that they managed the expectations as well as they could have. And those expectations were not met. So that creates more pressure on the next expectation that you put out there. I do feel strongly that you want to accomplish as much as you can after you get elected, because the people want to find out whether you keep your word and can you produce. George W. Bush came to office as a very unpopular president. He was elected by the Supreme Court. And the Black Caucus was refusing to acknowledge him as president. So we had challenges, but we tried to manage the process so that we could accomplish our goals, and we actually exceeded our expectations. We got our tax cuts done very quickly, actually during a time when there was an unintended or unanticipated challenge because Jim Jeffords from Vermont switched parties, and the control of the Senate went from Republicans to Democrats. So just as we're working on the tax cuts, we have to start negotiating with a whole other group of people. But I do think that they probably ran a little too fast on their legislative agenda, and I think they didn't run with a good process to their executive order agenda.
2 months seems like a very short time for something that
Thank
complicated.
So we have one here,
Yes, I'm sorry.
and we have a final
The
question.
very first person to show up.
There you go.
Well, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, what do you think was your biggest challenge or issue that you faced in your time working for the president as chief of staff?
Well, by far the greatest challenge is standing with the president when he has to make a decision that only a president can make. And that's to send young men and women into harm's way. Can I digress? I told this story to the president, George W. Bush, before he became president. It was the night before. He was going to take the oath of office the next day. And I had been deputy chief of staff at the White House to his dad. And there was a tyrant in Panama named Manuel Noriega, who had gone to the Canal Zone and arrested some Americans, put them in jail, and he was playing footsie with the drug lords, and he was doing bad things. America was not debating it very much, but it was happening. And some of the people that Noriega arrested down in the Canal Zone, they were all American citizens, but one of them happened to be a CIA operative. And as you can imagine, the White House would say, what do we do about this? So there's a process. And the National Security Team was working on the process. I was on the Deputies Committee. We worked it very hard. Came up with solutions, a number of solutions. Met in the Oval Office with the President. I was not there as a principal. I was there as a support staff. I was like in charge of the easel and the photographs and the satellite pictures. And Secretary Baker, James A. Baker III, one of my heroes, after the briefing, stood up and turned to the president and said, Mr. President, I'm leaving this decision to you. This is your decision. It's not my decision. It's not our decision. This is your decision. I'm leaving the decision to you. And he walked out of the Oval Office. And everybody got up and left with him. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the National Security Advisor, the Vice President, they all walked out. And I'm cleaning up the pictures in the easel, and the president gets out of his chair and he walks over to the desk and he sits down behind his desk. And he folds his hands and he's looking down, and I believe he's praying. His eyes are shut. And then he looks up, and I'm standing about 20 yards in front of him, but he's not looking at me. I'm like a piece of furniture. He's looking through me. But he makes a comment that changed my life. Because he said, I am making a decision that will cost young men their lives. And he got up, and he left the desk, and he walked out the door to the Rose Garden, and then started walking around the south grounds of the White House. And I was shaking. And I thought, I just watched a president make a presidential decision. But I was impressed that he made it, understanding the consequence. He didn't say, well, get that guy, Noriega. Or he didn't say, that's a great plan. No, he said, I'm making a decision that will cost young men their lives. That's a burden. So the greatest burden that a president has is asking others to do something that he can't do. Think about it. The Constitution, Article 2, right in it, the job responsibilities of a president. And there are no responsibilities except the ones that come from the oath that he takes. And the oath is the shortest oath taken by anybody who serves in government. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That's the oath, so help me God. And those words aren't written in the Constitution. Now, it's not taxes, it's not housing, it's not education, it's not the environment. Preserve, protect, and defend. The president cannot keep his oath without other people keeping their oath. That's the burden of a president, because when they make a decision that I need to do this to keep my oath, to protect the country, or to preserve our Constitution, he's asking others to keep their oath, to follow the command of the Commander-in-Chief. And the people that take that oath, many of them are very young. When they raise their hand and take the oath to follow the command of the Commander-in-Chief, there is no conditional clause to it. If I voted for him, if I agree with him, no, they have to do it. So when a president says, in order to keep my oath, I have to have other people keep their oath. He owns their consequence. He owns it. And a president can leave office, but that burden never leaves them. So I told the president that before he became the president, because I witnessed his dad doing it. That's the toughest thing. I could talk about lots of other things, stem cell research policy, great case study of how to do things right in a policy process. I could talk about Supreme Court nominees. I feel very guilty. I was a member of the group that recommended people for the Supreme Court for the President of the United States. I was one who did the vetting and got the work done to nominate Harriet Myers to be a member of the Supreme Court. And she ended up having to withdraw her name. And that is a very great burden to carry. So there were lots of things. Do I have regrets? Yes. Do I second guess? Yes. Did I have a phenomenal experience? Absolutely. Did I do the best job that I could at the time? I believe I did. Am I perfect? No. Do I invite all of you to be part of the process? no matter what your philosophy or partisanship is? Absolutely, and get involved. But the president's got the hardest job in the world, and most of that difficulty is not what we talk about on policy. It's that they carry the burden of causing a young man or a young woman to either lose their life or have their life changed forever because the president needed help. And that's why I don't think a president should be president unless he has the courage to ask for guidance. So, St. A's is a wonderful place because you are grounded in faith. Presidents must be grounded in faith. Question here, then I'll do you, Ashley.
Hi, Mr. Carr. It's great having you here tonight. I guess my question I want to ask has to do with the Iraq War, especially since it's one of my earliest political memories, and it's been discussed in numerous classes I've had this semester. So I know you've discussed it a little bit before, but I just want to know if you, in hindsight being 2020, and you had to do it all over again, what would be one thing you would change?
Okay. I actually think our intelligence was flawed. And I'm not talking about weapons of mass destruction, because I think that was a very tough one to get right because Saddam Hussein was playing games. He wanted the world to believe he had weapons of mass destruction. I'm talking about the intelligence that we were given that said going in would be much easier than it was. And it was phenomenally easy. We actually made it to Baghdad faster than anybody predicted, and I can remember, bogged down, they're bogged down. No, they weren't bogged down, they were moving so fast they slowed down to let the trucks that were carrying fuel for the tanks to catch up to them. So that's how, but the intelligence that we got from the DIA said that there would be significantly large units of Iraqi soldiers that as soon as we crossed the border from Kuwait to come into Iraq, that they would be waving the white flag and they would stand in behind us, not fight, but direct traffic and help with keep things moving. And that the bureaucrats in Iraq were really good bureaucrats. And they knew how to turn the lights on and get the water running and clean up the streets. And they would show up to work. So we didn't have to bring a bunch of people in to turn the lights on and get the water running and clean the streets. Well, the white flags didn't get waved, so that intelligence was flawed, and the bureaucrats were afraid to show up. So I think our flaw was we didn't anticipate the burden of preparing to win the peace after we won the war. And we won the battles pretty quickly, we didn't win the peace. And that's always hard. So yes, I wish I had a better understanding. Anybody else? Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. And Greg mentioned that I went to the University of South Carolina. They're in the Elite Eight basketball.
Hey, how are you? Yeah, good. Yeah.